Thank you for volunteering in Shropshire. This is a short overview of safeguarding children and adults, what you may see and how to respond if you suspect abuse when you're out and about. Please make sure that you've got something to make notes on, whether that's electronic or pen and paper, as there are reflective questions asked throughout this short presentation.
I'm Jessica Whitfield, a Service Manager at the Children's Society. Some information on this training has been provided by Karen Littleford, who is the Safeguarding Adult Lead for Shropshire Partners in Care. I'm going to co-deliver this training alongside Corinne Chidley, who is the Safeguarding Trainer for the Safeguarding Partnership, and also Sarah Hollinshead-Bland, who is the Statutory Safeguarding Business Partner for the Shropshire Safeguarding Community Partnership. What is safeguarding adults? Safeguarding is about protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. It's about ensuring people and organisations are working together to prevent and stop the risk and the experience of abuse, making sure that the adult's well-being is promoted and having regard to their views, wishes, feelings and beliefs.
We've already said that abuse can happen to anybody of any age. In this particular context, though, we're talking about adults with care and support needs who are 18 and above. And they are identified as having care and support needs because they need extra help for a particular reason. For instance, they may have dementia. They may have a long-term health condition. It could be mental ill health that somebody's experiencing or substance abuse issues. But any of those issues means they need more support to help them live safely in the community.
Safeguarding children is everyone's responsibility, and this includes protecting children from maltreatment, preventing impairment of children's health or development, and ensuring that when children are growing up, they are provided with safe and effective care. And taking action to make sure that each child has the best life chances possible. When we talk about children, we are including anyone who is under the age of 18. Child protection is part of safeguarding and promoting welfare. This refers to the activity that is undertaken to protect specific children who are suffering or are likely to suffer significant harm. This is when social services are involved and families will be working with a range of professionals. In a minority of cases, children will be taken into care. When we talk about child protection and the abuse that children experience in their own homes from the very people that should be there to love, care and nurture them, it could be physical, sexual or neglect. It's unlikely that children will experience these types of abuse without being emotionally abused as well, although it's important to remember that children can be emotionally abused without experiencing the other forms of abuse. We are concerned about all children who experience abuse. Research tells us that emotional abuse and neglect causes the most lasting damage to a child unless they receive the support they need at the right time from an adult. Children witnessing or experiencing domestic abuse in their own homes is emotional abuse. There is often a negative impact on children which affects every area of their lives. This can prevent them from reaching their full potential. Child exploitation is more likely to happen outside of a child's home. Exploitation is when another person befriends someone in order to exploit them, ultimately to make money. This is grooming. And often the victims don't recognise this and believe that they've got a genuine friendship or relationship. Although we're talking about child exploitation, this also happens to adults in Shropshire. Child abuse usually stays hidden, a horrible, damaging secret. People don't usually put their hands up and say, hey, look at me, look what I'm doing. Emotional abuse and neglect happen over a period of time. Some indicators of neglect that you may see or hear when you're volunteering may include a child who's hungry, a child who's withdrawn or anxious, a child who is left crying for long periods of time. A baby or young child may be left alone or outside by themselves. A child who looks dirty, and we're not talking about good old everyday dirt here. A child who's not had their clothes changed. There will often be several indicators that will be seen together, and it's really important to be vigilant and remember the safeguarding responsibilities that we all have. Have a think about this question. What would indicate to you that a child was experiencing neglect? And please take a moment to write down your answer.
Domestic abuse happens all across our society and all over Shropshire. Regardless of where you live, your age, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, gender, class or disability, please remember that fleeing from abuse and seeking support is a legitimate reason for people to leave their houses.
Have a think about this question. What would indicate to you that a child or adult was experiencing domestic abuse? Please take a moment to write down your answer. Domestic abuse is hidden behind closed doors, and at this time you may be the only eyes and ears around. If something you hear in the background when you're on the phone, or if you get a gut feeling or see something's not right during your interaction, then say something.
Children of secondary and primary age are being put in danger by criminals who are taking advantage of how innocent and inexperienced these young people are. Any child can be exploited no matter what their background, and the criminals groom the children into trafficking their drugs or weapons for them with promises of money, friendship and status. And once the children are drawn in, they are controlled using threats of violence and abuse, leaving them traumatised and living in fear and becoming trapped. Young people involved in exploitation often feel as if they have no choice but to continue doing what they're doing. Often the safest place for exploited children is within their own homes, as the risks are out in the community. Exploited young children are heavily dependent on our rail networks and often go missing, and they can return more secretive, have an increase in drugs and alcohol, and usually show more of an interest in money making.
Have a think about this question. What would indicate to you that a child or adult was being exploited? Please take a moment to write down your answer.
Let's have a little look now at the types of abuse that people can experience. What's in front of you are 10 headings, and pretty much all types of abuse fall under one of those headings. The first one is psychological. It's also known as emotional abuse. While I'm talking through some of these examples, try and think of your own, because there are lots of different types of abuse, and we're not going to have time to cover each one of them today. But under psychological, you might have things like name calling or taunting somebody. Under physical abuse, that's probably quite an obvious one. So that could be hitting somebody, kicking them, locking them in their room. For sexual abuse, it can be like any forms of abuse on a real continuum of things that are very low level, making sexual innuendos to somebody when they don't particularly want it or feel comfortable about it. It can go obviously to the very extreme end, which could be that somebody ends up being raped. The next one is financial or material abuse. And this can actually look like many, many different things. It could be having items stolen from your house. It could be having money stolen. It could be that people are trying to convince you to change your will when you don't particularly want to. So there's lots of different things to look out for when you're talking about these kinds of abuse. The other thing that's important to remember is when we talk about abuse, actually, most of the things that we're talking about are criminal offences. Sometimes talking about things as abuse can almost minimise what's happening, So it's very important to remember that a lot of these things are against the law. So our next heading is neglect or acts of omission. And that's about not responding perhaps to somebody's changing physical or mental health needs. It might be not giving the appropriate level of food and fluids to the person, resulting in weight loss. Again, neglect takes many forms, and I'm sure you'll be able to think of some examples for yourself. Now, discriminatory abuse is always a really tricky one to try and explain. Lots of examples of abuse that we can think of happen to adults with care and support needs because they are motivated by discrimination. But that's not necessarily what we mean by discriminatory abuse. This might be, for instance, forcing somebody to go to church when they don't want to go to church. It might be giving somebody meat when you know they're a vegetarian. It might be singling them out just because you don't like an individual. So again, takes many different forms, but give this one some thought. Organisational abuse is our next one. It's almost easier to start by explaining what it isn't. Organisational abuse is not about where abuse takes place. Obviously, there are many different types of organisation. We can all think of different places like hospitals. It might be within a hospital down to a ward. It might be a day centre. It could be a care home. But what we mean when we talk about organisational abuse is the systemic abuse of a number of people by a whole organisation. Think about, for instance, some of those programmes you might have seen, the undercover programmes. Winterbourne View springs to mind, and you saw quite a few of the staff there participating in tormenting and assaulting the people that they were supposed to be caring for. Well, that has become a systemic failure for it to get to that situation. So that is what we mean by organisational abuse. And now we're going to look at modern slavery. And please don't think that in sleepy old Shropshire modern slavery doesn't happen, because it does. And we do get referrals through about modern slavery. It's interesting trying to unpick what that means. And you'd think that actually in this day and age slavery didn't exist anymore. But people with care and support needs can sometimes be very, very susceptible to being exploited in this way. They could be made to work for very low wages, live in very, very poor living conditions, have their money and their benefits taken away from them to pay for their accommodation. So it's very, very important one to keep an eye open for. Domestic abuse we've heard quite a bit about, so I won't say too much about that. Only to remind everybody that it isn't just something that happens between people in an intimate relationship. This could be family members who are abusing each other, and that actually fits into the domestic abuse heading. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the last one really stands out from the others. All of the others above are forms of abuse that other people do to you. Self-neglect is something that you do to yourself. This could be happening for a number of reasons. It could be because you don't really understand what's needed to keep you safe, to keep you well, and to keep you healthy. It might be because you're deliberately refusing any kind of intervention, help or support. So that could result in deteriorating health problems. It might also include hoarding. It's not solely about hoarding, it's about those other things that we mentioned. Now, I'm sure that you'll be able to think of lots more examples yourself, so please continue to think about it.
Question 4. Have a think and write down, how do you think you would be able to tell if somebody was experiencing abuse? Particularly think about if they weren't able to tell you themselves. What are the signs that you would recognise?
Here are some more types of abuse for you to think about. They all fit under the headings that we described earlier, but let's look at them one by one. Hate crime. Now, we talked earlier about discrimination and the role that discrimination plays in abuse. And this is any offence motivated by discrimination or prejudice based on somebody's difference. Mate crime. Now, this is probably part of hate crime, and it's part of lots of different types of abuse. But it's a particularly sinister form of abuse where people deliberately befriend people who are particularly susceptible and vulnerable to this, and deliberately make them think that they're their friends. Now, there are some very famous cases. Please have a look at Gemma Hayter's case review. And what happens is very, very extreme. And we're talking about individuals that, in the worst possible situation, have ended up being murdered by those that have apparently befriended them. Cuckooing is a more recent word in our language, but this is where individuals and gangs take over the homes of particularly vulnerable people and involve them in their criminal activity. This is often associated with drug use and drug gangs. Now, the other one, this next one, is exploitation by people who are radicalised, who want to try and get other people involved in their cause. This is something that applies across the whole spectrum of belief and things that people are passionate about. So it's important to remember this is not just about Islamic and Muslim beliefs, but can also apply to right-wing groups who try to recruit people into their cause. And then we've got this last one, the exploitation of disadvantaged groups. And again, very much thinking about our modern slavery heading before. This is people who are targeted and forced into modern slavery for very little or no financial return.
We'd like you to access this short 3-minute video on safeguarding awareness for volunteers, as we were unable to play it during this presentation.
Question 5. We've heard a lot about who could be experiencing abuse and that abuse affects everybody of all ages and all parts of our community. But who could the abusers be? Have a think and write down which answers you think apply.
Here's some information about our websites where you can get much more detailed information. Please take time to have a look at the websites, and the following slides contain lots of links for you to get even more information and access to resources. Thank you very much for attending this training session.